Hi, everyone. Here we are, halfway through our course on the life of Christ. And we're beginning this week now to read the Gospel of Matthew and also the commentary or the chapter in our text on the book of Matthew and the Gospel of Matthew. So I want to say two or three things as guideposts as you read Matthew. First of all, you'll know that it is the most Jewish of the Gospels, especially the Synoptic Gospels, and so there are characteristics that uh, truly reveal that Jewish character. One of them is that constant reference to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Is what the Hebrews call what we call the Old Testament. Jewish people call the Hebrew Bible. And Matthew's formula is this was done in order to fulfill what was said back there, or this was accomplished in order that the prophet's words were fulfilled. And what I want to say about that is, first of all, that was not what they thought in the moment that that was happening. That was after the fact. In other words, Matthew was reading back into or looking back at those events that took place and connecting it to something in the Old Testament. We do this in our Christian life. We go through a difficult period in life, and once we get through it and we have a sense of relief, we look back and say, oh, this is what God was doing. We can't see it in the moment, but looking back on it, reflecting back on it, we see what God was doing. Matthew was doing exactly the same thing. When he had time to sit down and reflect on all the things that he wanted to put together in the gospel, and the things that Jesus taught, he connected it to the prophetic sayings of the Old Testament or of the Hebrew Bible to give, and he did that with a purpose. He wanted to show his own people that Jesus was, of course, the Messiah, the one that they were waiting for. He also connected it to the law. He connected what Jesus was doing to the law, because Moses was extremely revered, and the law was extremely important for those faithful Jews, especially the Pharisees. And so he connected to the law. Jesus was a fulfillment of the law. Some biblical scholars see the structure of the Gospel of Matthew similar to the structure of the 5 books of Moses in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And our author of our text shows that as a possibility in other ways that you can look at Matthew. The other thing I want to say about Matthew is that you will come to the Sermon on the Mount, and the Sermon on the Mount is possibly a collection of the various things that Jesus said over time. Because when we look at it, there is more there than just there's not a 3-point sermon, for example. And it is very likely that Jesus said the same thing on different occasions. He was in different places at different times. These things were not being written down, they were not being broadcast. So it is very likely that Jesus said the same things in different places, in different towns where he went, in order to make his teaching clear. And here is Matthew with all this collection of the things that Jesus said, putting them down, and calling it, and probably some of it was said there on the mount. Luke calls it. Luke makes it happen in a plain, and so biblical scholars talk about the Sermon on the Plain rather than the Sermon on the Mount. Plain meaning flatter area. So one of the things that when we come to the Sermon on the Mount, if we are honest with ourselves, at least I have to admit that I really don't like the Sermon on the Mount. It presents me with things that I have absolutely no idea how to respond to them, how to live them out. How do you turn the other cheek? How do you do that And here, again, it's part of our filter from our own culture, turning the other cheek. You just let people walk all over you. And one of the reasons I had you pay attention to that whole concept of honor and shame, uh, that's where you have to look at when Jesus talks about turning the other cheek. That whole concept of honor and shame has a part there. It's important to understand the culture. When it talks about, give to people who ask and give them more than what they ask, I mean, these things get really difficult. And what Americans do, what American Christians tend to do is, oh, this is really, I mean, Jesus really teaches hard stuff, and it's impossible for me to do it. I'm not going to do it. Basically, we live in denial about the Sermon on the Mount. We like the nice parts, but we don't like this part, those parts that tell us that we're to live in peace and that we're, you know, we're not to get angry and all that other stuff. It's important to understand the context of those teachings as well, because especially when we look at the part that talks about divorce, if you don't know the historical context around that, it's very easy to take that and go to extremes. So whenever we read difficult pieces in the scripture, and I'm thinking particularly about what it says about divorce in the Sermon on the Mount, because so many people have been affected by divorce, so many people have been hurt as they've read the gospel. It sounds like Jesus is being harsh. We have to look at the entire scripture when we look at one particular piece, and we have to interpret everything through what we know about the character of God and the character of Jesus. So keep that in mind as you read, because it is the Sermon on the Mount sounds pretty legalistic and harsh, and it's a standard that is extremely high, and it's not just about morality here. This is the kind of righteousness that God expects of his people. And of course, when we look at it, we all have to admit we have not lived up to that. Jesus knows it better than anyone. Keep that in mind as the Sermon on the Mount should be something that we wrestle with our entire Christian life, because there are things there that go against our culture, go against our nature, and yet this is what God is calling us to. It's not so much about doing. This is the Sermon on the Mount is about being. This is what a person, a child of God, is. Not what a child of God does, but this is characteristic of a child of God. Anyway, that's there for you to think about and wrestle with. And the last thing I want to say is about the parables, because Matthew brings in, we get a good dose of parables in Matthew. And I simply want to say, read a short little passage from this book. This is probably out of print now. The Parables of Jesus by Jehoiakim Jeremias. And I'm reading from the Second Revised Edition. And the parables, as I mentioned last week in my video, the parables are not nice little stories for children, and we have taken the bite out of them. And let me just read just a short portion here of what Jeremiah says in his book. And when he's speaking about parables, what we have to deal with is a conception which is essentially simple, but involves far-reaching consequences. It is that the parables of Jesus are not, at any rate primarily, literary productions, nor is their object to lay down general maxims. No one would crucify a teacher who told pleasant stories to enforce prudential morality. But each of them was uttered in an actual situation of the life of Jesus at a particular and often unforeseen point. Moreover, as we shall see, they were mostly concerned with a situation of conflict, with justification, defense, attack, and even challenge. For the most part, though not exclusively, they are weapons of controversy. Every one of them calls for an answer on the spot. In other words, what he's saying is that these are not little stories with morals to them. They have a historical context. They were meant to produce controversy, and they called for an answer on the spot. That's all I'm going to say about the parables right now, because I want to say a little bit more when we get to Luke, and I'll be referring back to them. But I want you to wrestle with that, what I've mentioned before about the parables. Why did these nice little stories make people so mad? The religious leaders mad. Why did these nice stories lead people to crucify him? The parables are characteristic of Jesus. We don't see this anywhere in other Jewish teachers. We only see a couple parables in the Old Testament. So this is uniquely Jesus, and Jeremiah believes that this is where we catch the authentic voice of Jesus when we want to know what did he really say, what was he really like. The parables tell us, and they were meant to call forth an answer on the spot. There's a lot more I could say, and I will say some more next time, especially when we look at Luke, because Luke has some wonderful parables that we don't find in Matthew, and I want to extend my comments there. So that's all for now. I hope you find this helpful. And please don't tell me that the parables have little morals, little stories like Aesop's fables that have a little moral after the moral of the story is. That's not what they're about. So enjoy your reading of Matthew, and I will talk to you later.